Do you ever ask yourself, am I playing too small? Have I left it too late to start afresh? Will I come to the end of my life and feel that I somehow let myself down? This is your invitation to hear from some amazing people who have asked themselves those very same questions and chose to wake the F up, to get off the hamster wheel of mediocrity and seize the life that was calling them. Be inspired and be challenged to discover who you have the potential to become and the contribution you're here to make. And now, here to guide you on the most important quest of your life is your host, Janet Hogan.
Have you ever experienced that moment where you wake up one day, take a look at the fellow lying in bed next to you and think to yourself, oh my goodness, the person who was the love of my life feels more like my roommate? And you find yourself asking, what happened to the passion, the sparks that once flew between us? It's like I'm living on autopilot. I've lost my partner, my lover, and it even feels like I've lost myself. If you're a mother, wife, or daughter, and you can relate to this, then perhaps you too have got caught up on the treadmill of people pleasing, where you put everyone else's interests ahead of your own. And if that's the case, you're going to love hearing from our next guest, who has walked in exactly the same shoes. But instead of staying stuck, misunderstood, and unhappy, she put herself through the emotional ringer to try and figure out who she was and why she felt so empty. Today, I take great pleasure in introducing Cathy Fyffe, who speaks to us not as a wife, mother, and people pleaser, but a much respected women's coach and mentor. Cathy, welcome to Wake the F Up.
Thank you, Janet. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today.
Well, it's lovely to welcome you on board. And I'd like to start with a bit of a rewind. Let's go back to your life before you had that Wake the F Up moment. You were working as a consultant. Just give us a snapshot of what was going on for you back then.
Yeah, so back then I was the mother of two of my own children who were sort of, 8 and 6 at the time, running my own consulting practice and being a stepmother to my stepson, who really didn't ever accept me as part of his life. But we had created a space in our home where we had him every weekend, but it was very challenging. And he was really the first person in my life that didn't like me, and I struggled with that. But we were okay. My husband was the sort of man who didn't love babies, and nurturing didn't come naturally to him. And my son was a very, very difficult baby. And so that sort of set up this dynamic in our household where I sort of was the primary person looking after the kids, even though I was running a consulting business. And I'd done that because I'd worked in government, at that sort of executive management level, but wanted to be at home for my children. So then created a practice that would allow me to work at home, support my kids, but keep me engaged and interested in life and still sort of being my own person.
So that's really interesting. So what I get from that is that virtually overnight you were cast in the stepmother role. Is that right? So you had your own children, but then suddenly you're a stepmother to this little boy.
Well, in fact, Liam, my stepson was already there before we had children. And in fact, when we then had our kids, for the first year of my daughter's life, he refused to even look at her because his mother had said to him, when they have children, they won't want anything to do with you. And so every weekend when we had my stepson, there was a lot of time spent trying to sort of reconnect with him and help him feel that we did want him around. And it was sort of this constant undoing the damage that had been done during the week and being definitely cast as the wicked stepmother by his mother. And it just was a really difficult space to operate in. And my husband found it very difficult because he wanted to support his son. He wanted to support me, but it meant he didn't do anything.
Yeah, it must have put a huge pressure on the marriage. In a conversation we had previously, you described your husband as that essentially cast himself as Switzerland. Can you tell me about that? What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so what happened was, because my husband wanted to support his son, which I get, like that's his child, and he did want to support me, but he didn't want to be seen to support me to Liam, and he didn't want Liam to see him supporting me. So in order to not upset either of us, he just became Switzerland. And so we had this triangle going where I think the three of us were all incredibly unhappy.
Yeah, I can imagine. By the time Liam was a teenager, tell us what was happening there and what was going on in your life.
Yeah, so those teenage years were really, really difficult because he was 10 when my daughter was born. And so when he was sort of 15, 16, 17, our kids were still very little, and trying to do anything as a family with such big age differences was very difficult. And Liam was a sort of kid that doesn't do small talk. So you weren't allowed to say, "Hi, Liam, how you going?" And because he didn't really want to have anything to do with me, there was no glue, like there was no sort of social intercourse, because I couldn't say, "How are you going?" because that wasn't allowed. So then we had nothing. And so it just, for me, every weekend felt like my home turned into this toxic environment where essentially I was hiding out in my bedroom as much as possible, because the air in the home just felt, and because the rules for Liam were different to our children, because he was only there on the weekend and his father didn't want to take a stand with him. Yeah, I felt absolutely sort of powerless. And like the words, like the anger could potentially explode at any time, because it was just this through that time. And I did have a few outbursts, and of course that, damaged the relationship further with Liam. And yeah, it was just a really tough time.
Yeah. It sounds like a terrible situation where you're a prisoner in your own home, but not allowed to, or didn't feel that you could speak up. So clearly this wasn't a sustainable situation, Cathy. So what happened?
Well, so this is where the sort of crux came, in the sense that up until then we had Liam every weekend. Then it came time for him to go to uni, and his mother had moved. We live in Melbourne, and his mother had moved him away to regional Victoria for his high school years. And he then he got into Melbourne Uni and needed to return to Melbourne to study. And of course, my husband, wanted him to live with us, given that it's his child. And I actually didn't want that. I also knew, that was a reasonable thing. And I tried to say to my husband, if, Liam is going to live with us full time, it can't be on the same terms and conditions that he lives with us, during the week, because I just will not cope. And essentially that was completely unacknowledged. And Liam moved in by stealth, in the sense that it was like, oh, look, he'll come for the first week or two and we'll see what happens. And basically he just came, but he stayed. But there was never any conversation about, okay, yes, he's here permanently, so let's talk about that. And what that meant was, as you mentioned earlier, like that feeling of being a prisoner, and just there was no escape because he was there all the time. And it was just having this toxic energy in my home where I felt misunderstood and unsupported by my husband. But I know Liam felt the same. And I know, my husband felt caught between the three of us. And I really got to the point where I thought, this is unsustainable for me. I don't want to live like this. And it just created a big disconnect with my husband and I.
I bet. Yeah, it doesn't sound like it was really working for anyone. So what happened? You did something that kind of broke this triangle apart, didn't you? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, so at that stage, I was really facing that dilemma of, which I'm sure a lot of women face: do I stay or do I go? And the thing was, I still loved my husband, even though we had all of this stuff in the space between us. And I didn't want to break up our marriage. but he wasn't on board at getting any help. Essentially he was saying the issues are mine. And so at that point I'm like, what can I do? And so I thought nothing's going to change unless I do something differently. And so that's when I rediscovered personal development, because I had been very interested in through my early 20s. And then when I met my husband, because he was so suspicious and, anti anything that he considered woo-woo, I'd given all that up in order to keep him happy. So I went back to that space and sort of really went on that journey of rediscovery of who I was as an adult woman, with, significant work experience, with a partner, a stepchild, children, etc. And really reconnected to the woman that I used to be, but the mature version of her. Got clear about my values, got clear about all of the beliefs that I hold, and in particular that, that core destructive belief that you talk about, Janet. And in my case, that belief was I don't matter. And I was one of the 8th child of a family of 11 children. So you can possibly appreciate how I took on that belief as a child. But it wasn't until I was 45 that I actually really got present to what that meant and the impact that it had in my life, and the role that belief played in the emotional landscape of our relationship, and why, when Nigel, from my end, seemed to take Liam's side, I made that mean that I didn't matter.
Yeah.
And so then when I went on that journey and really started to understand myself and what made me tick and why I would react to things the way that I did, and where that deep hurt was coming from, that's when I started to be able to make some shifts. And it was really that point of taking personal responsibility for what I created in my life, and most importantly, stop blaming my husband for everything that wasn't working.
Yeah. That's a great point to come to, because it's so easy. They're the ones who are the first in the line of fire, aren't they? Our significant other. And it's interesting you share that core destructive belief of I don't matter, because I can see so clearly how that could have been the negative narrative coming out of a family of 8 people. And then interesting, isn't it, how we then make the narrative seem true by going into a relationship where you don't matter, where you lose your voice, and where it's all about, pleasing the other person, who sounds, on the face of it at least, is making very unreasonable demands. But when you're driven by that story that's operating beneath the surface, we're not even aware of what's driving us, are we? We're following some kind of pre-programmed instruction, almost like a pact that we've made at a different, like a subconscious level, with a different part of ourselves, with maybe the fearful part. And I can see that the moment we start poking around in these areas, that's potentially very scary for the partner, isn't it? For your husband. Tell us how he responded to this inner work that you were doing.
Yeah, well, so the first thing I did was go on a one-day event, and I loved everything that that person shared with me with the room. And during the event, she was talking about a 10-day retreat that she was running in Thailand. And I was like, I'm going to that. And I signed up on the spot, and then went, oh my God, how am I going to tell my husband about this? And it was 4 months away, and I didn't mention it for 2 months. And I thought, I'm going to have to tell him, because we've got 2 kids, 2 school-age children. And when I told him, he was incredibly angry, and why are you doing that? And, just very fearful. And right up until the day that I left to go to the retreat, he still could barely look at me. Like, he was just so hostile. I went, communicated with them while I was away. They were quite loving when I was away, but and through that 10 days really went on a massive sort of transformation, and did a lot of digging into who I was and what I wanted and needed, and how I showed up, and all of those things. And when I came back, I was full of hope about how we could transform our relationship and I could rebuild things. But he was still so angry that he completely shut me down. And every time I tried to talk about it, he just wouldn't have a bar of it.
Really? Wow.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
So how did you navigate that past? Because I hear this a lot, and I've even experienced it personally, particularly in the beginning, because I think women tend to be more open to exploring emotional areas, but for men, that can be terrifying territory. And I know that in the beginning, when I started exploring this inner self, I would have to be very careful how I couched the whole, program that I was going to do and justify the cost of it and all of that. After a while, it became clear that it was actually good for our relationship. But how did you, navigate that terrain? Because I imagine you would have come back from that trip thinking, oh, my problems are solved. So what happened then?
Yeah, so because he completely shut me down, I was like, oh my God, like, what do I do now? What's my next step? And of course, at that point, my support was all back in Thailand. So I then started to look for some other coaches and mentors and basically stopped trying to communicate about what I was doing and just did the work myself. So basically, it was sort of head down, bum up for a while and stopped trying to change things, just kept the relationship going, continued to mother my children, kept working. But things weren't great. Like we struggled on for another sort of year and a half. And then for me, I got to the point where I desperately wanted, or I had gained so much from this myself that I wanted to make the same sort of impact in other women's lives. And I approached my mentor at the time to see if she would take me on in her business, and which she did. And that absolutely freaked my husband out because he was like, why would you do that? Isn't it enough that you're doing it for, that you're already playing in this space for yourself? Why would you give up your consulting work? And very fearful that I would grow away from him. And I think his core fear was that I would leave him.
So what happened?
Well, so I had to keep reassuring him that no, that wasn't the intention. The intention was actually from my end to rebuild the connection. And essentially me wanting to follow that path was actually about me coming back to my own truth. And the fact that I had given up so much of the things that I was interested in through my life in order to keep him happy, and that I could no longer do that. And this really did sort of become a bit of a deal breaker for us, or a line in the sand, where I said to him, in the same way that I love and accept all of the things about you that I don't really like, but I do because of who you are, I actually now need you to give some of that back to me. You may not want me to do this, but it's really important to me, and I'm going to do it. And at that point, part of me was like, if he walks, so be it. I just could not keep putting myself second to him. So I still remember we had the conversation out in the backyard, and he sort of said, well, this is a potential deal breaker. For me, I didn't sign up for that. And he left. And I remember coming back inside thinking, if he leaves, so be it. And wasn't sure actually whether I wanted him to go or stay. Like, it was really, I don't know which would be a better outcome here, because it was pretty not great, where we were right then. Anyway, he came back and very ungraciously said, oh, well, if I go, I'll go and live in Darwin and I'll never have anything to do with any of you. So I guess I just have to put up with it. And that started, a series of sort of year-long conversations about what it would look like, what it would mean, and me constantly trying to reassure him that the fundamentals of our marriage were intact, that I had no intention of leaving him, but that this was what I wanted to do and where I wanted to put my energy in the future. And he stopped putting up objections, but he definitely wasn't a supporter. And what that meant for me was, the first time I got on stage, for example, when I was, running and co-presenting an event with my mentor, I couldn't come home and share what that was like, My first coaching clients and getting results for people, there was no, he wasn't interested. Like, it was just something he was tolerating without, he wasn't actively objecting, but he wasn't in my cheer squad. And this went on for a number of years. And so I just got on with my life, and we were still a little bit parallel. We'd come a long way, but it still wasn't awesome. But I was so much clearer and able to stand in my own truth and know what was important to me, where my boundaries were, how to better parent my children, but also how to communicate with him in a way. And I stopped making him wrong, because I felt like that's what he was doing to me. And so I needed to not keep doing that to him. But there was still that piece missing. And as a result, I actually started to develop an autoimmune condition, which was all brought on by emotional stress. And one day I said to him how heartbreaking it was for me that he wasn't supportive. He said, "Oh, I don't stop you doing anything." And I said, "Yeah, I know you don't, but you're not on my cheer squad. When you roll your eyes at me when I tell you about something," I said, "that breaks my heart, and it stops me sharing what's really important with you." And that conversation was life-changing for us, because he finally got that it wasn't enough to just not object. I actually needed him to support me. And yeah, from that day forward, he's really done a complete turnaround. Then when I left my mentor's business and sort of mid 2019 and then created my own program, because I wanted to work with women whose stories most resonated with mine and where I felt that I could have the biggest impact. And, whilst he was like, "Do you really want to do that? Why don't you just stick with the consulting? Like, it's so much easier." I was like, "Yes, it is, but it doesn't fulfill me in the way that my coaching work does." And so he was like, "Okay, if that's what you want, I'm with you." So the difference now is, he celebrates my success. This little necklace that I'm wearing, it says, "You are beautiful inside and out." He gave me that when I ran my first solo event. He's open to hearing the stories that I tell about, my clients and the things that they're achieving. And yeah, really, we're just close, connected. Like 10 years ago, I would not believe that it was possible for us to communicate the way we do now. And I know his love language. I know how to speak what I call into his listening, because I know his values. I know his version of the core destructive belief. I know all of those things about him that allows me to connect and honor him in a way that has him feeling loved, seen and heard for the truth of who he is, in the same way that I want to be. So it's really been a life-changing experience, not without its pain, of course. Thankfully for me, a happy ending.
Yeah, and thank you so much for sharing that. That's of such great value, I'm sure, to many people listening to this, because normally what happens when a relationship kind of hits that area of stuckness, we don't know how to take it forward, that's when you might think about couples therapy. But how often does that work? Because you're dragging your partner along, he doesn't want to be there, and it almost makes things worse. But what I hear from you, Cathy, is two things that seem like the pivotal things that made all the difference. That moment when you put yourself first. In other words, if he wasn't going to come along, you were just going to do this anyway because you had to for yourself. And then the second time when you said that you really needed him. And so it was an invitation to partner up, but at a whole new level. So that was very inclusive. It wasn't like, "Oh, this relationship sucks, we've got to do something about it. And, I'm implying that it's all your fault." It wasn't that at all. You made yourself really vulnerable, and I can see why he came across. And it's really helpful to hear that. And also, the amount of time that it required, it wasn't overnight, was it? We're talking years.
That's right.
It was a slow evolution. Yeah.
My mentor used to say, you know, my husband is changing, but at a snail's pace.
Yeah.
And it was a very slow, a lot of people could do it a lot quicker.
Yeah.
That's what it took for us.
Yeah. Well, I think a really important lesson I get from hearing your story is that the worst mistake we can make is try and change our partner. We can only change the thing that we have control over, and that is ourselves. But what's interesting is when you did that and you occupied that heartfelt space of talking to him from your heart, you know, and saying, I really need you to support me, or it's not good enough. It was an invitation for him to step up. But in other words, he did change, he did grow, but as a result of the work that you put in on yourself. And I find that tends to be what happens. You know, if one partner decides to go out on a self-development journey, it's very scary for the other one who's left behind. And it usually is, I think the ratio of women to men who do inner work, it's mostly women, about 80%. So chances are it's going to be the male partner who's left behind. But in my experience, what I see is when, you know, the woman goes out front, takes that, if you like, emotional leadership role and does the work, it only ever has a positive effect on the relationship, unless there's some kind of irreconcilable difference. But the tendency is usually that it's beneficial for both. It's just that one person has had to take the lead on it. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's, you know, it really speaks to a lot of us who get to that point where we go, is this all my life is about? You know, it doesn't get any better from this point. And, you know, something is saying to us, well, that's actually not good enough. Where do we go? And it's the scariest place of all, I think, because there's so much resistance. So well done you for persevering. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, Cathy. So where did all of this work lead you to?
Yes, so because I discovered that when I did the work, my relationship was able to recalibrate, even if he wasn't on board in the same way that I was or wanted him to. I really and I knew a lot of the women in the work I'd been doing with my mentor were in that space of, you know, that sort of midlife 40 to 60, where the patterns that we thought served us well for those earlier years and, you know, the focus of parenting and all of that, we start to be able to, our kids get a bit older and suddenly we've got a tiny bit more time. And then we start to go, hang on, you know, who am I? Where did I go? And like you said at the start, like, who is that person that's occupying, you know, the other half of the bed in the house? And they start to question what their life's about. Will the relationship survive, etc., etc. And they were the people that I wanted to help, because I knew I've walked that path, and I knew that what I had learned and honed over sort of 6 years of working in my mentor's business, as well as my formal qualifications, would allow me to create something that addressed those needs. And so essentially I've created a program that I call Create a Life to Love. And it's all about taking women on that journey of personal transformation, but in a way that's permanent and long lasting. So it's not a quick fix. It's not come away for the retreat and have a wonderful time on the weekend and bye-bye, good luck once you get home. Because it's taken us, you know, many years to create the patterns and the beliefs in our systems, and we don't change overnight. So my program is about supporting and guiding women as they embody the changes that they want to make. And I take them through all of those stages of, you know, taking personal responsibility, knowing what their own personal big why is, what their beliefs are. So not only the core destructive belief, but, you know, what do they believe about being a wife and a mother and a worker and a woman of a certain age and money and all of those things that drive the way we show up in the world. What are their highest values, and why is that important in creating that life that you want to live? We look at their emotions and the fact that our emotions are our body's way of communicating with us. And if we don't listen and tune in, then our body reacts. Like we have to turn and listen and allow our body to feel those emotions. Then I think I'm possibly one of the only people in this space that also then includes a lot of work around communication. Because if we're talking, but I layer in the communication and the relationship stuff, because that's what so many of us are dealing with. So we talk about how to have that successful conversation and what are the barriers to conversation, and then how to have the difficult conversations that if we don't have, the stuff doesn't go away. We know it just stays in the space between us. And so we talk about how to frame those up and all of the things that allow couples to reconnect, but also in, any relationship, friendships, siblings, etc. Then we look at boundaries, because we teach people how to treat us. And if we're going on that growth journey, often the way that we've let people treat us in the past is no longer going to work for us. So it's learning how to create those new boundaries and bringing the rest of our family along for the ride. How to create more fun and joy in our life. So one step before that was that, understanding why so many of us are perpetual people pleasers, why we talk to ourselves the way we do, why we struggle to ask for help. So all of that nitty gritty stuff that drives the way so many of us women show up every day. And then it's about how do we take that step forward, or that vision for our life, based on that deep knowing we have about ourselves now. So knowing, what's our big why? What are those core limiting beliefs? What are our values? How do I show up in arguments? How do I want to show up? What's the stuff that actually lights me up? And how do I bring more of that in so that I then have the tools to create the life and the relationship that I want to live? So I really try and take them on that whole journey.
Yeah. And you've walked the path yourself, as you said. So now you can take them on that journey, but it doesn't have to take as long, does it? It's a compressed journey, although it's not overnight. I think one thing that's worth mentioning too, Cathy, is sometimes we think we have to be on the verge of separation or divorce to take action, but actually we don't really, do we? I mean, I live for the day when this kind of work that you do becomes commonplace. It's kind of what you do rather than the exception to the rule, because nothing bad seems to really come of it unless the relationship wasn't meant to be really in the first place. But generally, one of the businesses we used to run was a wedding business. And I was talking to a psychologist about, the divorce rate, because it was sad seeing couples invest all this money in the wedding day, but not really so much in life after that day. Yes. And he maintained that about 85% of divorce was unnecessary. In other words, the problem could have been solved if the couple had only known how to do that or be guided in some way. And I think what you're sharing here is a really good example of that. It would have been so easy for you to take the easy path and go, oh, this is all too much, it's not working, I want out. And then, of course, what we know is that those same behaviour patterns that got you to that place will just keep playing out and out and out. It doesn't matter who the partner is, we experience the same issues over again. So thank you for sharing that. I think you've raised some really important points. And of course, your details will be shared in the show notes if people want to get in touch with you. One of the things I love doing on these calls is just showing a little bit of processing work in action, so that you realize that it doesn't have to be that uncomfortable or painful either, that sometimes you can get realizations relatively easily, and that can really shine a whole new light. So it's not just about solving problems, but it's also opening up a future potential that maybe we don't see. If you're listening, I got Cathy to complete the magic triangle exercise. And the idea with this exercise is to go through a whole bunch of potential needs, things that would make a big difference to your life, and bring it down to your top three. So, Cathy, you came up with the top three needs were freedom, expansion, and peace, with peace as the number one. So what I'd like to do is just explore what each of those mean, and then we can extrapolate from that. What does that actually say about your path going forward? And we'll just see what the triangle has to reveal to you, Cathy. All right, are you ready?
Sounds fun, yes.
Okay, so let's go with freedom first, because freedom is such a loaded word. There's so many different ways to interpret that. But in your case, Cathy, what does freedom mean for you? Freedom from what?
So freedom to me is multi-layered, as you said. I think one of the fundamental or foundational aspects of freedom to me is really financial freedom, because it's only when I feel that security and that my financial needs are met that I then have the freedom to explore life and live the way I want. But freedom means to me, or it's one of the reasons why I run my own business, so that I get to choose when I work, where I work, how I work, how often I work, when I get up. Like, actually having that freedom and that flexibility every day is hugely important to me. But it's also freedom of expression and freedom to be all of who you are and to walk your own truth. So it is quite multifaceted, as you said.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I imagine also it's about freedom within a relationship, isn't it? You know, that old expression, the ball and chain and all of that, that it's rather than feeling a prisoner within a relationship, that it's finding, would that be right? It's about finding freedom within that relationship.
Absolutely. Particularly in our relationship, my husband and I are wildly different people. You know, we've got to that place, like so many couples think we have to do everything together, or you know, we have to socialize together, or that our partner needs to meet all of our needs. And we very much operate as two individuals that come together at various, you know, points of connection, but we're quite independent. Now that he is in a place where he trusts and accepts that I'm not going to leave him, and that actually the relationship is, you know, a massive priority, and that I want to be with him, you know, I'm able to explore my freedoms, you know, so I'll go off on a road trip or regularly go away with girlfriends or experience things that I want and I'm interested in, but that he's not necessarily. And that's okay. We get to have our own views. You know, with the situation in the world at the moment, he and I have vastly different views, and that's okay. I don't have to think what he thinks, and he doesn't have to think what I think. We're allowed to be free and, you know, sovereign within our own.
Yeah. So I love that so you can have your Thelma and Louise moments, but you don't have to go all the way and drive off the cliff.
Correct. That's right.
That's true freedom.
Yeah. Yeah.
The next core need was really interesting, expansion. So speak to me about that one, Cathy. What does expansion mean for you?
Yeah. So that's, I guess, becoming more important as I go on more and more of that inner journey and that connection to spirit. For me, it's about recognizing and opening up to the abundance and the wonders of the universe, and that expansion of our own hearts, our own energy, expansion of our mind, or, you know, my mind, my feelings, my thoughts. It's really, that's interweaved with growth. It's, yeah, I'm not sure.
No, I think that's you're tapping into the spiritual side. And, you know, pre-COVID, I wonder if we could have even used the word spirituality with someone saying, oh, we should go and join a hippie commune up in Bali, where I'm recording this now. But, you know, the fact that the word spirituality is more and more finding itself in common parlance, you know, that we're talking about this extra dimension that previously was rarely spoken about. So yeah, that I totally understand that. And then the final need, the one that sits at the top of your triangle, if you like the star on the Christmas tree, is peace. So yeah, tell us about peace. What does that mean to you?
So peace, for me, peace is actually about feeling at peace in my own heart. So it's within and without. So, you know, if I refer back to those years that we spoke about earlier, and the emotional turmoil and that constant uncertainty and gut churning, you know, do I stay? Do I go? What do I do? How do I navigate this? that constant grind was very, very difficult to navigate. And all I wanted was to just feel calm and at peace in myself. And so essentially I have that now, but I also know for me, it's peace in mind. So if my kids are fighting, it's not that my kids are fighting, it upsets me. It's that it upsets my sense of peace. It's why, you know, I've worked from home for 20 years, but I never have the TV or radio on during the day. I like the quiet. It's why I'm drawn to nature. Like, I just like peace.
Yeah.
And then obviously the broader meaning of peace in terms of peace in the world, and again, peace in everybody's heart is really where that comes from.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. So now that you've defined those three needs, let's look at what that describes as your journey following those three things. So just to explain how the needs work, a need comes from experiencing the opposite of it. So, you know, as a basic example, we crave a long, hot summer if we've known a very long, dark winter. It's the opposite of what we need that causes the pain in our life. So if we look at peace, for instance, being your core need, you shared with us a lot at the beginning of this interview about lack of peace, you know, that discord that you were feeling, the discord between differing values, or feeling something and not being able to speak it, you know, that misalignment, not being able to show up as yourself. That creates a kind of an inner turmoil or chaos, doesn't it? Yes. So one thing to understand is that a need comes about for a very good reason that relates back to our past. And that's why we feel so passionate about it. And that's why it informs our work going forward, because the greatest passion is born from pain. And it's funny because as a society, we run away from pain. It's ironic, and yet it's the greatest gift. Because imagine, Cathy, if you'd never had those moments of discord, if you'd never had those moments of suffering and misery, would you be doing the work that you're doing now? No. Yeah. So this is why this exercise is powerful, because it comes directly from your pain. Your pain actually articulates the journey. So how it works, you know, we talk about the why, you've got to find your why. And the question is, but what does that even mean? But really, in very simple terms, your why is whatever you need most to do that will give you what you most need, created by the pain of the past. So here it's very simple. It's peace. So really your why becomes peace. It's all about the pursuit of peace for you, because you've known so painfully the opposite of that. And then the elements at the base of the triangle actually are what will guide you to that peace. So essentially, why you do your work, why you get out of bed, is to bring peace to others, because in bringing peace to others who too might be going through disruptive relationships, or teenagers who aren't speaking to them, or just feelings of inner turmoil because how they're showing up in the world doesn't align with who they really are. That's your gift, because it's your most precious thing for you in your life. And so that's what you have to give to others. So that's your why. What gets you out of bed in the morning is the thought that you might be able to deliver peace to someone else, just as you had it delivered to you. Your what is freedom. So what you bring to people is the freedom, as you articulated, to be themselves, to be free within a relationship, to not have to compromise, to be able to show up as you are. And interestingly also, it seems to speak to the freedom to do work that you love, because that's what you're doing now. You have freedom of hours, financial freedom, freedom to make the money that you need to make, and the importance of that. So understanding that you can't just go out and start doing work that's a hobby, that it needs to actually bring money in as well. So that's what. So that's basically the content, if you like, of what you deliver. And then the how is really interesting. The how is expansion. So how you do that is you start to bring people in connection with their spiritual self. That's the key. That's the way you deliver the freedom to satisfy the core need of peace, is to open them up to that unspoken territory that we rarely delve into, which is that intuitive aspect to us. That is without boundaries, without limitation, opening people up to that expansive aspect of who we are that we normally don't even touch on. And perhaps we're not even ready to engage in those conversations till we reach a particular age. So does that resonate for you, Cathy?
Absolutely. It's interesting because in my work, we call it your big why, and my big why is peace. So it's interesting that it came out as exactly the way you were saying. And very much resonate with what you were saying there.
So what rise up as needs, ultimately, if you really follow them, say that's like your North Star, they become your highest values. So your highest value is peace, and the way you deliver peace is through your second and third highest values, freedom and expansion. So they really articulate your journey, and you can trust it because it comes from you. You know, your intuitive self has chosen that. So the thing that we have to be aware of is whatever can threaten those three things, and to be conscious of that. So knowing that these needs were created by an experience of the lack of those. So you've known lack of freedom, you've known lack of expansion, where you felt you haven't been able to grow and you've stayed as that constricted self. So you know the pain of that. So let's look at the most important need, which is peace. And the way to, it's a bit counterintuitive, but the way to really anchor that is to face the very thing that can threaten it. And that always comes from fear. So in the same way that your husband was responding in a fear-driven way to you doing this work, because it represented so much threat and so much change. We have an aspect in ourselves that does the same. It responds like, it's like an inner husband that's saying, no, don't change. Stay the way you are, because we know that self, even if it might not be the ideal self. So let's just address that so that we're aware of that. And in my 5-door model, I call this doorway 1, you know, the worst case scenario. But we have a tendency, us humans, to run away from it. But in fact, we have to be powerful and counterintuitive and face it. So what I'm going to ask you to do now, Cathy, is if you imagine that peace as your highest value is sitting to the right side of you right now, and you can even just start to imagine that bright future where peace really does reign. And it sounds like it's already doing that, you know, it's already featuring in your life through your work. But just as if to say, yeah, that's the star I follow. Now, to protect that star, we have to know what the dark cloud is that could obscure it. So just imagine now that you're flipping 180 degrees to your left and you see the opposite of peace. Now, what would that, if you were to describe that in a word, what would the opposite of peace be for you?
Conflict.
Conflict. Okay. All right. So are there times in your life where you've known conflict beyond what you've shared with us on this call, times earlier in your life where you knew conflict?
Yes. So again, being one of 11 kids, I had one particular brother that he and I clashed quite a bit. We were both quite strong-willed, and he was 5 years older than me and thought that because he was older, he should have more rights, and that, you know, his needs were more important than mine. And I think I used to drive him crazy because I was very articulate and I could mount a case as good as his. And yeah, that used to drive him crazy. And so we had conflict there. And I guess just the day-to-day sibling stuff. But I guess I then really didn't have a lot of conflict until my relationship.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. So just so everyone understands how this works, it's really interesting because every one of us has like a core fear. So say it's the fear of conflict, because when you've got an older brother who's 5 years older, that for a child, that is seriously dangerous, isn't it? There's a risk there. You can get physically hurt.
Yes.
And so the behaviors in our adult life tend to mirror, they're a reflection, an exaggeration, in fact, of the behavior patterns in our early life. So if we reverse engineer this and go, okay, the opposite to peace is conflict, and fear of conflict is what is motivating my behavior. In other words, if And the fear of conflict is actually triggered by a belief of, say it's I don't matter. Then while you imagine I don't matter, it's less likely that you're going to get into fights with your older brother or anyone else. You're just going to go, yeah, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to speak up. I'll just sit with it. I'll let him, be right, rather than engage in conflict, because conflict represents danger. So it's actually the story, if you like, that core destructive belief that creates the fear. And then, of course, because it's such a debilitating belief, isn't it? I don't matter. It's the opposite to life affirming, and creates a sense of shame around that. Then what happens is part of us wants to prove that wrong, and that's where we'll go out and say, well, whatever the opposite of I do matter, and try and be significant. But and that's what we call the overcompensating self. So, and that's where we might show up in a way that feels like we're doing the right thing, but it's to prove something to others. It's not necessarily coming from ourselves. And that's where we can find ourselves in this crazy pain pendulum, basically vacillating between I don't matter and, I'm here to conquer the world. Neither of them is sustainable.
Yes.
So thank you for sharing that. And of course, once you bring this stuff to the surface, then you can start to deal with it. As they say, when you're in it, you can't see it. When you can see it, you're no longer in it. So thank you for being willing to go through that exercise, just so that, we can start to understand what makes us tick, and that it doesn't have to necessarily take a long time to unravel what it is that might not be working for us. Yeah.
That's exactly right. Once we create that awareness, we then have the choice, don't we? It's when we don't have any awareness that we don't know how else or how to move forward.
Yes.
Or change anything. Yeah.
Yeah. And Cathy, have you ever worked with anyone who's done the inner work and they didn't like who they saw? They didn't like who they saw themselves to be. Has that ever happened for you?
I think so what happens for some people is they very anxious about taking the Band-Aid off things that they've had hidden, and there can be fear around experiences they may have suppressed, and that makes them nervous. My experience shows that it's not that they don't like what they see, it's that there's unhealed wounds and more stories of shame that the process then invites them to learn to love and accept all of who they are, and embrace that stuff that we don't like. We all have stuff that we don't like about ourselves, but it's the stepping into the embracing and the forgiving and the self-compassion that allows us to heal some of that stuff. And I think for most people that start this work, it is because there's aspects of themselves they're not happy with, but it's not what they find out that makes them unhappy with who they are.
Yeah, no, exactly.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's right. I know I was always, I had an inner fear of doing any kind of work into myself, anything that was self-reflective, because I thought, what if I don't find anyone there? What if it's empty? Right. And I've never found anyone to not appreciate more fully who they are once they strip the stories away, because the stories are just that. And it's why it's why we suffer, because there's a dissonance between who we intuitively know ourselves to be and how we're showing up, or how we feel we're being treated, or the lot that life is dealing us. Yes. And when we can reconnect those two so that they're in alignment, well, that's really where you find peace, isn't it? That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, would you say it's worth it, Cathy? When you look back on the time that you invested in all of that, would you ever have gone the other way and gone, no, I would have been better not opening up this Pandora's box?
No, absolutely not. Because if I hadn't have done that, I would have left. My children wouldn't have grown up with their father in their life. I mean, I don't know where my life would have led, but my life is infinitely richer for the work I do, as are all of my relationships. So my friendships, my relationships with my siblings, the connections I have with strangers, because I know and understand myself, I bring a new level of understanding to interactions with other people, and, able to sort of make those connections at quite a deep level really quickly, because you recognize that there's no point keeping the mask on.
Yeah.
Who's that for?
Exactly.
The richness lives in the truth.
Yeah, totally. And just one last question. What would you say to someone who would say, oh, doing all this work, this inner work, it's selfish, it's inherently selfish, and it's even narcissistic? What would you say to that?
Couldn't be further from the truth. I think it's actually the biggest gift you can give, not only to yourself, but to the people around you. So, because when you do that work to deeply know and understand yourself and let yourself be seen, it automatically helps you to understand others in a way that you wouldn't have before. It's the key to building genuine relationships, instead of hiding in, the distance or the unwillingness to be vulnerable and really share anything of yourself. So I think that perception, as you mentioned earlier, probably comes more from fear than anything. And it's absolutely not self-indulgent at all. It's life affirming and life changing.
Thank you, Cathy. I totally see that. Yeah. I love the fact that you're willing to share your story so that others can see that you've walked the path yourself and some, and the great reward that comes at the end of it. So if people want to work with you, Cathy, what's the best way? We'll share all the details, of course, in the show notes, but just for now, how can they reach out to you?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways, Janet. For those that go, oh my God, Cathy, yes, I understand exactly what you say, and I want to go on that journey. I do have the opportunity. I run sort of what I call free Love Your Life consultations, where 45-minute chat, and we can talk about what is that next right step for you, and at least help people take one step further on their journey, as well as sort of talking about what is that step-by-step to permanent transformation, just so if people are interested in doing that. The other thing that people can do is I have a free 45-minute masterclass, which is all about that, how to rediscover you, rebuild your relationship and create a life to love. So that's full of very practical and implementable steps that people can actually use right now without necessarily having a one-on-one chat. So both of those are available.
Excellent. Yeah. And masterclasses are great because you get to tell whether someone resonates with you or not, and how they are in front of a group. And yeah, I think it's a great idea, and you always learn something. Yes. So Cathy, thank you so much. Really appreciate your openness, being open to share the most painful moments and go back to that territory with such grace and ease. So thank you very, very much.
That was my pleasure and an honor to be here with you, and thank you for creating that opportunity. And I hope that, our conversation has opened some doors for people around what's possible for them.
Absolutely, yeah. If it just helps one person wake the F up, it's been a worthy exercise.
A worthy spending some time doing, yeah, for sure.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you.
You have just listened to another enlightening episode of Wake the F Up with Janet Hogan. To find out more about the breakthrough, guided way to get off the hamster wheel and seize a life of freedom and fulfillment, visit janethogan.com/podcast for access to the show notes and to learn more about Janet's breakthrough work. Just remember, finding your true path isn't potluck, it's a process. Until next time.